This is this shiur I've called the 4 parentheses 1,000 questions. And I thought to take a look at question asking both in the context of the Passover Seder and potentially more generally as a Jewish value. That was sort of my intention when I conceptualized this. As I think as it shakes out, the focus is very much on question asking at the Passover Seder. So if you do have insights about how what we talk about pertains to other aspects of Jewish life, do bring that in, because that was part of the original vision and it may be kind of left out. And maybe that's just, I think I got plenty of material, so maybe that's just, something to say for the future, but know that is in bounds for tonight. Question asking, the sort of the impulse to question and interrogate ideas is, I think, one of my very favorite parts of Judaism. And I've heard from a lot of other folks, especially people who come to Judaism either from a different religion or no religion, the question asking piece and the sort of embrace of interrogating ideas, interrogating assumptions is really something that a lot of people value. I think it really kind of harmonizes with the scientific, critical, side that a lot of people in the modern world have. And that works out really well for me, although obviously I'm not unbiased at all. My other intention was, since we're less than 2 weeks away, to help folks get ready for their Passover Seders a little bit, either whether you are hosting and thinking about how to create a question asking atmosphere at your Seder, or to participate as someone in a Seder, how to bring sort of the right intention, the right approach. I have some thoughts about what that approach ought to be. So part of this is also to help us get ready for our Seder. I envisioned a number of kind of guiding questions to explore, so that I just kind of want to put out there. More or less in the order we'll address them. We'll talk about what kinds of questions are there. If you've never thought about what kinds of questions there are, I'm going to ask you to do a bit of characterizing of some sample questions. We're going to look at the role of question asking. In other words, like the purpose, what does it accomplish, specifically within the Passover Seder, but also more broadly. And we'll think about how we might go about infusing our starim, our Passover Seders, with questions, with a question-rich environment, a way to enhance our Pesach experience. One more thing, just kind of as a disclaimer to keep in mind. When you ask about the purpose, I'll put scare quotes around purpose, of any tradition, it's perfectly possible to answer that the purpose of the tradition is tradition, right? Tradition, why do we do it? Well, it's tradition, right? That's a very Jewish answer. It makes for a very short shiur if the answer to why do we ask questions? Well, that's just what the tradition is. So I think that's real. There's real value in upholding the traditions of our ancestors just for its own sake. But for the purposes of our purpose tonight in examining the purpose of questioning in specific, but traditions of the Passover Seder, I think we're well served to kind of leave that idea aside and assume that Pesach Seder traditions have some kind of didactic or developmental purpose that we're going to try to dig down and discover. Okay. So the first thing, like I said, we want to get an idea of what kind of questions are there. How might we characterize various questions? Now, it's a cliche phrase you've probably heard. There are no stupid questions. Now, that is very true in here. You can ask in my shiurim anything you want, and there are no stupid questions. But what even is a stupid question? A bit of advice that I once got, I think on my way off to school. So I think it must have been from a parent, but I actually don't really remember, but something that stuck with me. Someone told me to ask good questions, which I really quite like. But on the other hand, what even is a good question? These are stupid questions, good questions. These are subjective evaluations, not necessarily useful characterizations of a question. So I want to look with you at some sample questions, which I've pulled from familiar stories in the Torah. So we can practice basically characterizing them in ways that are more helpful. And I hope that we can try to use as much as we can, try to use adjectives or short descriptive phrases, really characterize the questions rather than sort of explain the story behind them. I'll give hopefully enough background context to these stories so that if you're familiar with the story more broadly, you should be able to know. But even if you aren't, looking just at the context, do your best to try to characterize these questions. We can also think then about what they're for, what they're trying to accomplish in each scenario. Okay, we'll jump to our first example. Here's my source sheet for you. One sec to arrange some windows. All right, very good. So our first sample story comes from the very beginning of Bereshit, the very beginning of the book of Genesis. Now, so well, actually, I think let's start with reading it. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 1 from Genesis chapter 3, verse 1? Who would like to read? All you got to do is take yourself off mute. Holly, please. Thank you.
Now the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?"
Very good. Thank you, Holly. So this is from the story right at the beginning. Adam and Chava, the first 2 human beings, have been created. And what God actually said was that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, could eat from any tree in the garden except the one tree in the middle, what the text calls the Eitz Hada'at Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So how would you characterize the serpent's question? The serpent asked, did God really say you shall not eat any tree of the garden? How would you characterize it? What sort of adjectives, words would you use to describe it? Mike, go ahead.
It's a question that's testing her own knowledge.
Okay.
It's challenging her to see how he could possibly manipulate her if she doesn't answer it
good. Okay.
correctly.
Excellent. So I heard test, challenge, those are good characterizations, but potentially manipulative, that was on my list of my brainstorm list, right? Because I feel like we have every reason to believe here the snake knows what God actually said, right?
Sure.
And if you know how the story goes, then that makes sense. Richard or Sari, what were you going to say? Thanks, Mike.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I started to think of it as a leading question, although I don't think that's exactly what it is, because a leading question is usually a question where you're kind of directing somebody towards the answer you want them to give.
Right.
It's a little bit like that, but I guess the snake is kind of, he's sort of pushing her into a place where she has to defend herself in some way.
He's definitely fishing for an answer. Right. He's definitely fishing for an answer. I put for what it's worth, I put on my sort of brainstorm list. I also put leading in a bad way.
Yeah.
Right. Like he's clearly trying to elicit a particular response.
Mm-hmm.
But as Mike said, it's for the purpose of manipulating. Davis suggests instigating. I think that's a good word.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Lynn, go ahead.
I was going to say manipulating in the sense that the snake maybe doesn't care about the answer so much as kind of getting Eve a little bit off center.
Sure.
Questioning her own knowledge.
Right.
So something like deceitful or full of guile, manipulative, something like that. Yeah, right. The snake's fishing for an answer, trying to sort of get her to bring up the tree, right? Make it look like her idea, right? This is classic manipulation technique. Yeah. Okay, very good. We're off to a good start. Let's look a little further in that story. It's source number 2 on the page, a little further on. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 2 there? Richard or Sari? Go for it. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay. The Lord God called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Then God asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" The man said, "The woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate." And the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman replied, "The serpent duped me and I ate."
Thank you, Richard. So you hopefully are at least a little bit familiar with the story. Adam and Chava go ahead and eat from that forbidden tree. They get duped by the snake, as Chava puts it, and they perceive for the first time that they are naked, and evidently feeling self-conscious about that. They hear God moving about in the garden. I'm going to set aside the theological implications of what that could even mean for a moment. And they hide among the trees. And God then asks a number of questions. God asks, where are you? Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree which I had forbidden you to eat? And lastly, which I think is properly punctuated with an interrobang, both a question mark and an exclamation point. What is this you have done? How would you characterize God's questions here?
It strikes me that God knows the answer to all of those questions.
Okay, so a lot depends here on on your theology, right? Is it possible that God doesn't know the answers already, right?
Yeah, like
if we assume that God actually doesn't, I mean, that has real theological implications, but if God doesn't, then they're innocent, right? They're legitimate requests for more information. We
could be a rhetorical
to believe
question.
that God does in fact know the answers, right?
They're rhetorical, but they're rhetorical questions. But on the other hand, I think God wants to hear their answers.
Good, right? Yeah, can you come up with a word for that? So rhetorical, yes, but a word for that's like we're wanting them to answer. Holly, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say direct. They're just very.
Oh, okay.
Clear.
Okay.
Also, kind of maybe probing.
Like
trying to get at something underneath.
Right.
Or even shaming.
Okay, good. Yeah, so these questions sound kind of familiar from Parenthood. Like when I know who hit who with what, it's still important for them to say what it was they did wrong, right? So leading, but in this time, like fishing for an answer, but in this case, in a good way. Right, Mike, go ahead.
I was going to add to bring out their thinking process. How did you get from here to there?
Good, okay.
Something just struck me just looking at this in print, that God's questions are where, who, and what.
Yeah.
But I think God is really asking why.
Yeah, good. Good.
God knows the answers, but God is really saying, why did you do these things?
So let's flag that a little bit about how what God is actually asking is not necessarily the exact content of the words, right? Like, yes, they're who, what, where questions, but I think you're right. They sort of add up to a big why. Very nice. And I think also important to note too, as we go on and continue to think about question asking as a general phenomenon, these same questions can be characterized very differently depending on the assumptions you make about the asker, right? Whether we assume they already know the answer or whether we assume they already don't. They become very different questions, even though the words don't change. Very nice. Okay, any other thoughts about God in the Garden of Eden? And Chava? You're doing great. I think we're getting the juices flowing, analyzing some questions here. Let's go into a few more examples. Can I get another volunteer to read source number 3 from a little bit later in Genesis? This is in this case, God appears to Avram. That's Abraham before the name change. God appears to Abraham in a vision, and God makes a promise to Avram. And Avram's going to ask a question in response. So Lynn, please go ahead.
Then God said to Avram, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans or Chaldeans?
Chaldeans is good. Very nice.
Chaldeans, to assign this land to you as a possession. And he said, O Lord God, how shall I know that I'm going to possess it?
Good. Okay. So God makes a promise that, I brought you out from Ur, which is somewhere east around the Fertile Crescent, to the land of Israel. And Abraham asked in response, "O Lord God, how shall I know that I'm going to possess it?" How would you characterize Abraham's question? It maybe helps to think. Is it similar or different in any interesting ways from the questions from the previous story?
Seems like
Margaret, go ahead.
it seems like maybe it's a clarifying question.
Okay, clarifying question, maybe.
More information, more specifics.
Okay, good. Margaret, go ahead.
Well, he doesn't question that
Mhm.
he's going to get it. He just wants to know how is he supposed to recognize it.
Good. Okay. So it's sort of a new question word we haven't had yet. It's not necessarily a what or a why or when, it's a how. Right? How am I going to know? Good. Any other thoughts? Some words I came up with. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Holly. Yeah.
Oh, just my first reaction was kind of like pleading or like a little desperate.
Yeah. So I noted that too. I put fearful or uncertain potentially, or seeking reassurance. There's something else going on here. Like yes, on the surface, Abraham is asking, how am I going to know? In other words, sort of what's the sign, or what can I sort of put stock in? But and if it helps to sort of make this make sense, right after this, God says, okay, bring me some animals and stuff like that. And they do a covenant, like a formal covenanting ceremony, which is, and this is gross, they cut animals in half and then they pass between them. And the sort of symbolism is like, if either of us breaks this covenant, we're going to be like those cut in half animals. And that was sort of an ancient Near Eastern way of, signing a contract with one another. So, God goes through with the formal ceremony, which I think is part of God's answer to this question. How are you going to know? It's, well, I'm going to make a contract with you. But that's not all that Abraham's asking, right? He's sort of asking also, what kind of reassurance can I have? But also, like, why would you ask that if you weren't yourself a little bit fearful? He's also saying, I'm a little bit scared about all this. So he's kind of probing or searching or something like that too, yeah? Good. Let's keep going. I got a couple more, and we got a lot to go through tonight. I hope I didn't pick too many examples. I think these are all really good. How about source number 4? So we're jumping ahead to the book of Exodus. And at this point, this is part of our Passover story, as a matter of fact. The Israelites they've been told they can leave Egypt. They have started to flee, but they're now trapped. They're trapped in between the Sea of Reeds and Pharaoh's pursuing army. Okay, can I get a volunteer to read source number 4? And we'll characterize the Israelites' question. Mike, thanks, go ahead.
And they said to Moses, was it for want of grace in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt, saying, let us be, and we will serve the Egyptians, for it is better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness?
Okay. This is a very different kind of question. I think you'll agree. How would you characterize these questions?
Sarcastic.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like what's become the classic Jewish question, the sarcastic question of what do you take me for?
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. This is a whole archetype, right? Margaret, I saw you appear briefly. Were you gonna add something too?
Well, it's whiny. This happens
Whiny.
more than once.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses actually asked God at one point, why did you pick me for these terrible people?
Right. Right.
It did not go smoothly. It isn't a step-by-step process where you can see exactly how it's going next. There's a lot of glitches. There's a lot of hitches. There's a lot of there being ordinary human beings.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So yes, they're sarcastic. Are they trying to be helpful? Doesn't really seem like it, right? Like if they were trying to be helpful, maybe questions like, how are we going to get across this sea? How are we going to hold off Pharaoh's army? Like, who knows how to swim, right? Those are helpful questions. These are not. They are like deliberately unhelpful questions, right? And even though they ask there's like 4 or 5 of them, do any of them add, like, could they have just asked the first one? Do any of the subsequent questions add anything new? Not really, right? It's like that first line, was it for want of graves that you brought us here to die? Like, they could have left it at that. After that point, they're just sort of piling on. what's behind these questions? You know, we've noted already that sometimes there's a question behind the question or expression behind the question. What would you suggest maybe is behind these questions?
Fear.
Fear, yeah.
Yeah, feeling overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what else,
Yeah.
Mike?
Fear of the unknown.
Yeah, definitely.
Life in Egypt may not have been great, but at least they understood it.
Sure.
I think their fear is coming out as anger.
Yeah, is pretty familiar. It's sort of expressing, you know,
Mhm.
bubbling out as frustration,
Mhm.
something along those lines, right?
Maybe some regret.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad things worked out the way they did, I suppose, on the whole, for our sake. But at the time, I can sort of see the, you know, I can see the argument. You know, the unknown is really scary. Good. Okay, let's do one more, which is actually, I thought about whether I wanted to go back in the story order or not, but I think it kind of makes sense to do so. We have one more short line, source number 5 there, back in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. We're back at the burning bush. And God has just told Moses his mission. What does Moses say? Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt?" What kind of question is this? How would you characterize this last one?
Timid.
Good. Timid. Mm-hmm. I can sort of you can almost hear his voice quaver as he says this, right? Yeah, Richard's here.
I was going to say humble. It reflects some humility on
Sure.
part.
Yeah. Yeah, Margaret.
Well, you have to realize that he was raised in the court. He knows all the soldiers, all the courtiers. He knows what a whopping big deal the palace is.
Sure.
And that he had to flee. And going back just does not appeal to him.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So again, I think a lot depends on what we assume already about the asker. Is this an expression of Moses's, you know, very, very laudable character trait of humility? Or is this an expression of his realism that he knows, oh, these are the guys I had to run from, you know, because I killed that guy, right? So it could be very different. I think it occurs to me that maybe this is a kind of self-talk. You know, the text says he said it to God, but I can almost hear Moses almost talking to himself, almost inside his heart. Who am I, really? I think this is also sort of one of those questions that's really a statement. If I were to try to, you know, you could very easily phrase this, the purpose of this in a statement with the period at the end, right? Something like, "This is not a good idea," or "I'm not worthy of this." That would fit just as well in that space, I feel like, right? Okay. So thanks for this you know, doing this little exercise with us. You did wonderfully. To circle back a little bit to kind of characterizations of questions like we did versus evaluations. We didn't talk at all about, are these good questions or bad questions? I think it should be clear by now that whether or not a question is good or stupid or what have you depends a lot on the purpose that's trying to be achieved. For example, like I said, if the Israelites were trying to mock or deride Moses with their statements, then yeah, those are actually pretty good questions, right? But if they were trying to be helpful and supportive, those were very much not good questions. So a lot depends on the purpose, right? Imposter syndrome, Holly says. Yeah, I think there's who could, and you know, I think we can derive a kal v'chomer from that. You know, if Moses felt imposter syndrome, all the more so it's okay if we do sometime. We're those of us who are not at his level, right? Okay, so now that we've put some thought into what kinds of questions there are and what questions can do, what they can be for, let's dig into some of the questioning that actually goes on in the context of a Passover Seder. So when I bring up the idea of questions at a Passover Seder, where do your minds jump first?
4 questions.
Thank you, Susan. Very good. The 4 questions, right? So for one thing, we got to note that there's actually really only 1 question and 4 answers. really 4 answers to one central question, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, how is this night different from all other nights? So on the one hand, if you're familiar with the 4 questions from the Passover Seder, we have this kind of prescribed, directed questioning as part of the Seder night ritual. But to get at the underlying purpose, the role of question asking within the Seder, I think we got to look at some conceptual concepts from the Talmud that are going to help fill in this kind of idea. What's questioning for? Can I get a volunteer to read source number 7? So these are both from Tractate Pesachim, which, as you can hear, has Pesach in it. It's all sorts of stuff from the Talmud to do with Pesach. And one other note about the way these translations are pulled from the website Sfaria, and the translation of the Talmud they have on there is what they call an interlinear. So they everything that's bold is basically a straight across literal translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic text. Anything that's in not like regular font is added to make it make sense or to add useful information. And I've actually stripped away some of that explanatory stuff because I think it gives it away too fast. But just so you know that's how this is going. Okay, volunteer to read source number 7, please. I think we've mostly gone through I think pretty much most folks have read. Susan, please. Yeah.
Okay. The sages taught in a Baraita, all are obligated in these 4 cups, including men, women, and children. Rabbi Yehuda said, what benefit do children receive from wine? Rather, one distributes to them roasted grains and nuts on Passover Eve, so that they will not sleep and so they will ask questions.
All right. So Susan, do you think you're able to sort of interpret that, explain it in your own words? What's the gist?
So is he saying that they don't give the children wine, but instead they give roasted grains and nuts?
That's what he suggests. That's what Yehuda suggested.
Okay. So it's they want to encourage children to ask questions.
But since wine, like even they didn't give kids wine.
Will make them sleepy.
Yeah, you give them snacks, right?
Yeah, give them snacks, keep them up.
And the point is so that they stay awake
and
ask questions, right? Excellent. Okay. So let's break this down, because actually there are multiple kind of interrelating pieces here. Let's look at that, just the initial first sentence. So when it says the sages taught in a Baraita, what a Baraita is, it's like an outside text. You can imagine sort of the version of the movie that existed before the editors, cut it all down to the theatrical release. So a Baraita is sort of a rabbinic tradition that got cut from the final movie and didn't make it into the Mishnah, but they've brought it now back in the Talmud because it's still authentic material. So they're bringing it in to their dialogue. So the sages teach a Baraita, which is not it's not attributed. It's anonymous, which is actually more potent, interestingly. And they say all are obligated in these 4 cups, including men, women, and children. What can we infer from that initial Baraita? What else do we learn from that statement? What might you have thought before you heard this statement?
You might have thought that, for example, would not be obligated because, as we just said, they'll fall asleep.
Good. So interestingly, the initial statement is the kids have to drink, which is interesting. I sort of wonder, if Rabbi Yehuda had not spoken up, really, would we be like, feeding our kids wine? I don't know. But in any case, so good. You might have thought this was something that would only be for grown-ups or only maybe for men. There are certain mitzvot, there's certain rituals that are only incumbent on subsections of the community, right? So whatever the purpose of the 4 cups is, and interestingly, it doesn't say, it just says 4 cups. It doesn't necessarily say of wine in the first line. So maybe that's sort of the implication. There's 4 cups of something, and maybe that's why kids are involved there. In any case, whatever the purpose of those 4 cups is, it applies to everyone, regardless of gender and regardless of age, right? Good. What about Rabbi Yehuda? So Rabbi Yehuda says 2 things. First, he says, what benefit do children derive from wine? What can we infer from Rabbi Yehuda's question about that baraita?
I guess it implies that adults get something from drinking wine.
Good, yeah. So he at least understands that there's some kind of benefit to the drinking, right? There's a purpose to these 4 cups, and he calls it a benefit. He calls it toelet, right? Okay. The translation of toelet is something like benefit, use, value. He understands this to be not just for funsies, although maybe that too, but also there's a point, there's a purpose to this, right? What benefit or use or value might 4 cups of wine provide to an adult, but not a child? I mean, this may just be a size thing. Somebody said that the kids will fall, you give a kid enough wine, he'll fall asleep, right?
And if you give an adult some wine, they'll ask more questions.
Ah, okay. So you're 2 steps ahead. What happens before question asking, though? What does wine do to you at a party?
It makes you more outgoing.
Sure, more relaxed, more outgoing.
Fewer boundaries.
Fewer boundaries, right? So maybe lowering inhibitions, right?
Right.
Good. Davis suggests a different perspective, potentially. Maybe the perspective from on the room from under the table. I don't know. Depends. Very good.
Maybe it's a feeling of being a free person.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe there is something else there that you have to, right? Suggest it like freedom from slavery, right? This is something that only a free person would get to do. A slave would never get to have, an elaborate, drinking party. Good. Yeah. I would say the only thing no one said yet that I would maybe suggest besides, relaxing, loosening up, lowering inhibitions, maybe something like honesty. People tend to be pretty honest when they're drunk too. That's a good strategy for getting someone to tell you the truth as well. Good. But you can see how that would not necessarily work for kids, right? So Rabbi Yehuda understands there to be a benefit, potentially something along the lines of what we're talking about. Now we can examine this proposed alternative, giving kids snacks. And I think we can make 2 inferences from this, that this is the proposed alternative. One, the benefit from snacks should be the same as wine, right? If it's substituting for the kids who he doesn't contest the Brida. He doesn't suggest that kids are not obligated. He just is suggesting what's something else we can do to give them the benefits. So maybe snacks have a way of relaxing or lowering inhibitions for kids. That actually kind of makes sense. Kids like it when you give them snacks and treats and things like that. Second inference, the benefit of the wine should be the same as the snacks, right? Which is ultimately where it ends up. The purpose of the snacks is not to sleep, and so they'll ask questions. So the purpose of the wine should therefore be, there's probably some kind of transitive property going on here, staying awake and asking questions. There's another part where the Talmud suggests if you drink the equivalent amount of wine, the equivalent of 4 cups equivalent of wine, but you drink it all at once, you've done the mitzvah of celebrating on a holiday, but you haven't done this mitzvah for whatever you haven't done the 4 cups worth. So maybe there is actually something else to the sort of spreading it out so that you're not falling asleep, but maybe kind of keep a good buzz going or something along those lines, right? So this is sort of an elaborate way of establishing. I think that the wine has something to do with creating a conducive atmosphere to questioning. Just like Mike said, the lower your inhibitions are, the more relaxed you are, potentially the more questions you'll want to ask, or just feel at liberty to ask.
I thought of something else, which is when drinking wine and eating snacks, both of them kind of stave off hunger, which is an issue with a Seder, right? The longer it goes on, the more hungry you get. But when you get hungry, it's a distraction. Right? You're thinking,
Sure.
about what food are you going to eat than you are about what's going on.
Sure.
So-
Yeah, I like that too. I think that would contribute to the kind of creation of an atmosphere for question asking. People are staying focused, right? They're staying dialed in on what's going on.
Right, and they're not stressed out by, by a growling stomach.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice, Harry. Thanks. All right, let's do one more. Okay, so, oh, actually, wait, before I had more thoughts on that. Okay, so like I said, connecting the dots, relaxing, lowering ambitions leads to engagement. Raise your hand if Passover Seder has ever felt stressful to you. Okay, I can tell who's hosted a Seder before and who hasn't, maybe. These days, over Zoom, probably much less so, but Passover can be really stressful, right? It's having people over, so it's cleaning all in advance of Pesach, right? It's an elaborate ritual. You got to make sure you have all the things you need. The karpas doesn't come up until later in the ritual, but you got to make sure it's on the table right at the beginning, so you don't have to get up to the kitchen and get it. Like, there's a lot. So of course it can be kind of stressful, and that emphasis on order and tradition has, I think, a sort of unintended consequence there that can really stress you out. So I think this is really important to remember as we think about the Seder experience we want to create. If we are hosting, if we want to accomplish this goal of engagement and question asking, we got to get people to relax, and we got to relax ourselves. Now, we already have one good strategy, which is have some wine. But I think it's worthwhile to think about what else can we do, and we'll circle back to this sort of at the end. What else can we do to encourage that relaxed, engaged atmosphere? Okay, now we have to ask though, why do that? Why is this a worthwhile goal for a Seder, right? Oops, I just lost my participant stamp. There we go. Okay, so to answer that question, let's read another text from Talmud. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 8? I think most everyone has read already, so go ahead and go again. Oh, Stephanie, please.
The sages taught, if his son is wise and knows how to inquire, his son asked him. And if he is not wise, his wife asked him. And if his wife is not capable of asking, or if he has no wife, he asks himself. And even if two Torah scholars who know the halachot of Passover are sitting together, and there is no one else present to pose the questions, they ask each other.
Thank you. Okay, so first things first, I just want to acknowledge basically the patriarchy and heteronormativity of the statements. They're clearly operating under assumption that the male patriarch of a household is leading the service, leading the Seder, and that there's no mention of female children, it's just sons, right? The assumption is he'll have the male patriarch will have a female wife. I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to ask you, do you understand there to be an implied hierarchy here? Like, is this a progression from the most ideal case to subsequently less ideal cases? And if so, why or why not? Is this presenting a hierarchy?
Yeah, I think maybe it is.
Okay, say why.
I think it may be going from people that are not expected to know anything up to people who do know everything.
Okay.
So you've got the son, and then the wife, and then the head of the household himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you've got the Torah scholars. So it's kind of implied that, yeah.
The most ideal case is which one?
I guess the most ideal case is actually the first one.
Okay.
Right? If his son is wise.
Right.
Meaning
So,
that you want the person who's asking the questions to actually really need to know the answer. But they-
Okay.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that makes sense. If you understand the purpose of question asking at the Seder to be actually learning new information, then I think that makes sense. Because, right, the son we would expect to have the least existing knowledge, perhaps the wife to have the second least, you know. But and this could just be patriarchy, right? The ideal, the quote unquote ideal case in the rabbis, the all male rabbis' minds is male to male generational transmission of religious wisdom. Anything else than that is somehow, a degree off. But that requires the two scholars to be the least ideal, right? If the assumption is there's no, like the point of question asking is you ask questions and you learn new information, why does it not just end after his wife asks it? Like, why would it bother to say he asks himself if he's all by himself, I guess? He asks himself, or if two scholars who know all the halachot, they know all the laws and traditions of Passover. If it's just them, why do they have to still ask each other? And remember, we're disallowing the tradition answer. Okay, Mike first, then Susan.
Well, I guess my answer is going to be tradition based because it's a commandment. You will ask the questions.
Tov, okay, that is absolutely correct, and also not very much fun. So I'm implying that I think there's got to be another purpose to question asking here besides just learning, answering questions for learning new information, or just doing it because it's tradition. Let's assume there's something else we can dig up here.
The purpose is asking the questions. That's the whole purpose. It doesn't, and reliving the experience through asking questions.
Good. Okay. So it can't just be about learning the halachot of Pesach, right? Why would they do it anyway? So possibilities are tradition for its own sake. It could sort of be like, I guess what I'm hearing you say is like it's part of the exercise of remembrance. Like the way to sort of experience Pesach is by interrogating it, right? Something like that. Mike, were you going to jump back in? Go ahead.
I was going to say the purpose is to tell the story. And what better way to tell a story than to have people ask questions?
Okay, it could be as simple as that. It's just a more interesting storytelling when it's participatory. It could, yeah, that could absolutely be it.
Proves people are awake.
Sure, yeah. Lynn, what else?
It seems like the value here is not so much knowing, even if you're an incredibly accomplished scholar, the value is asking.
Right. Yeah. My only other thought was that somehow there must be some kind of, like, to use educator jargon, an enduring understanding from the Exodus that is somehow evoked by question asking. But I think what this is all, like, these are all sort of getting at is this idea of really creating an experience. Like, the Seder is not just a story tell. It's an experience of the story, right? And I think what we get from this passage is that the question asking is somehow integral to that. I think it applies that it's not just about the content of the questions that get asked, but it's about the experience that a question-filled environment creates. Somehow that experience has to be what the Seder is all about. Holly says it's interactive rather than performative. Yeah, maybe so. I mean, definitely yes, but like, yes, that's somehow a superior experience. It's not just that if there were a quiz at the end, the students would get better scores for having done the question and answer thing. It can't just be that, right? Because then it would be, then we wouldn't have the scholars being obligated to. They would already ace the test, presumably. So there's got to be something about creating an atmosphere, creating an ambiance, creating something like that for people to go through at a Passover Seder. So if that's so, and question asking is all about creating this question-filled environment, what makes a good question at a Passover Seder? Because it seems like if it doesn't have to do with the content, if it's not about learning halachot, not about learning laws and traditions of Pesach, it could be just about any question that enhances this experience or contributes to that experience, right? Well, good news. the Passover Haggadah actually has preserved, I think, an evaluation along these lines in the form of a well-known midrash. Okay, this one's a bit longer, but you will recognize this is the midrash, the midrash of the 4 sons or 4 children. I couldn't change the title; it still says 4 sons. I did my best to gender neutralize as much as possible because I think there's no reason we should not read this as archetypes of 4 children, gender aside. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read this one straight through? I think we'll just do it straight through. Anyone mind doing a bit of reading? I think everyone has had a chance just about. So if you've read it once already, Richard, go ahead. Thanks. Appreciate your willingness.
Sure. Corresponding to 4 children did the Torah speak. One who is wise, one who is evil, one who is innocent, one who doesn't know to ask. What does the wise child say? What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you? And accordingly, you will say to them, as per the laws of the Pesach sacrifice, we may not eat an afikomen, a dessert or other foods eaten after the meal, after we are finished eating the Pesach sacrifice. What does the evil child say? What is this worship to you and not to him or her? And since they excluded themselves from the collective, they denied a principle of the Jewish faith. And accordingly, you will blunt their teeth and say to them, for the sake of this did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt, for me and not for them. If they had been there, they would not have been saved. What does the innocent child say? What is this? And you will say to them, with the strength of God's hand did the Lord take us out from Egypt, from the house of slaves. And regarding the one who doesn't know to ask, you will open the conversation for them, as it is stated, and you will speak to your child on that day, saying, for the sake of this did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt.
Thank you. Okay. So a common critique, I would say, of this midrash, because this is, from a modern educational, child rearing framework, this isn't great. Pigeonholing kids into wise and evil is not necessarily a great recipe for success. Interestingly, I think if we were to ask around the Seder table most often, I think and who do you identify with the most? I would not be at all surprised to find that any of the subsequent 3 children, innocent or evil, innocent, or don't know how to ask, would be the most popular selections. But a common critique, I would say, of this midrash is basically comes to the defense of that child who was labeled Rasha, who was labeled evil, right? Because what's wrong with this child's question? They quote the Torah accurately. You can see each wise child. The reason I call this a midrash is because each of them is quoting a verse. They're choosing a question from Torah to ask as their question. And the evil child quotes a verse from Torah, and totally accurately. They say, Maha avodah hazot lachem, what is this worship to you? And in fact, that verse and the following one literally say, and when your children ask you, what is this worship to you? What do you mean by this avodah? You should say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because God passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when God smote the Egyptian, but saved our houses. It's like the Torah fully expects this question to get asked. Moreover, what seems to be the criticism that they said you and not us, well, the wise child says exactly that same thing and doesn't get his teeth smacked, right? He also says, what are these testimonies that God commanded you? So what's the deal? Like, what is the essential difference that makes this child's question this child a rasha and this one a chacham, this one evil and this one wise. So I suggest there are lots and lots and lots of ways to read this midrash, but let's look at this through our framework of basically good questions are ones that contribute to the experience, the question-filled environment experience, and bad questions are ones that don't do that. It's not about the content of the question, it's about the asker's goal in asking it. What are your thoughts so far? But before I tell you what I think, looking at it that way, if the content of the question is besides the points, what might be what might differentiate these children then into wise, evil, innocent, doesn't know? It's possible I didn't ask that question particularly clearly. Mike, go ahead.
Well, from what you just said about the questions coming straight out of Torah, it's like the wise child has already been deemed the wise child, and the evil child is already believed to be the evil child, and the father is making these categorizations based on prior experience, or prior belief of their experience.
So I would say that's potentially maybe the second most common critique of this is like, yeah, if there doesn't seem to be a substantial difference between the questions I asked, then maybe this is just how all these children have been prejudged, and maybe we should really get beyond that as a civilization. Yeah, very possible. So maybe the wise child is wise because they ask a question that leads to more questions. And I have support from this, from the Midrash. So note how they answer the wise child. So they answer, as opposed to the other ones, they answer, you should say to them, as per the laws of the Pesach sacrifice, we may not eat an afikomen, which here we'll insert the words for folks who might not know what afikomen is, a dessert or other foods after the meal. Usually it's just another piece of matzah after we're finished eating the Pesach sacrifice. And that's from the Mishnah, from Pesachim. Now, if you don't already know what the Mishnah is, it's like the first layer of rabbinic commentary, trying to codify the oral tradition with the oral tradition of Torah interpretation, take it and codify it into a written document. So we're talking about the early third century of the Common Era. So in the Talmud, right after the Mishnah that's quoted in response, if you look at where this, so the way the Talmud works, it takes a little bit of Mishnah and a bunch of Gemara, a bunch of Talmud sort of expanding on that, and then another little chunk of Mishnah and a bunch of Gemara, a little chunk of Mishnah, a bunch of Gemara. Ask Holly, we've been working on this together. Holly can explain all about that. So right in the Talmud, right after they quote this Mishnah, the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of afikomen? Rabbinic literature is all about questions. So the wise child might be wise because they ask a question that leads you into rabbinic literature, leads you down a path of subsequent question asking. And it's right there in the Talmud, actually. This is immediately you answer with a statement, but a statement that needs explaining with needs unpacking with yet another question. What even is an afikomen? It's not a Hebrew word, it's a Greek word, so it needs explaining. So maybe the wise child is wise because they ask questions that contribute to that atmosphere and lead to more questions. Maybe the evil child is evil because their question shuts down further questioning. Now this is tricky because, like I said, they quote a verse that's very similar from Torah, but I think there must be something about how they ask this question. The implication must somehow be that they're not really actually interested in participating in question asking. When they say to you, they mean it in a different way than the wise child does. And we saw how that is true. We looked at those questions from Torah where there's it depends a lot on what you assume about the person asking the question, right? Or there's sort of a statement or a question or an emotion being expressed by a question, right? So maybe they're not interested in participating. So they make others uncomfortable somehow. And they inhibit them from asking their own questions based by the way they sort of superficially participate. They ask a question, but they're not really in the spirit somehow. And that way they're detracting from this environment. And so they're they are called Rasha. They're evil and not helping here. Turning to the innocent child, I think the innocent child then is just trying to participate. They ask a question, but they're still acquiring the knowledge base that's necessary to ask questions that they really get the intellectual juices pumping and really lead to more questions. And the one who doesn't know how to ask may actually just be the one who's not yet relaxed enough to ask. They don't know how to loosen up yet. I think it's also revealing too, if we often add in the word how there. The child who doesn't know how to ask, although this translation is honest, it just says she'eno yodea lishol, who doesn't know to ask, which I think could imply they don't understand that that's how we play the Seder game. The Seder is a question asking game, and they don't even know that's how you're supposed to play. So they don't even know that they're supposed to be asking questions. It's not that they don't know how to ask any question. They just don't know that that's how you participate. That's how you Seder, right? By asking questions that contribute to this. What do you think? Are you buying it? I rather quite like it, but I fully expect that there are holes in this explanation. What are your thoughts?
I like it. I think it makes sense.
Thanks, Richard. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what was I going next? Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, Richard. Richard and then Margaret. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's actually me.
Oh, sorry. Terry and then Mike.
I kept talking, but I realized he had muted it. Yeah, no, I think your hypothesis sort of fits, because it fits with what we've been talking about, that if the purpose of the Seder is to promote questioning, which promotes interaction, which promotes learning and engagement, then a question that stops conversation is a bad question. Yeah, like we're layering that onto it, but I suppose if asked perhaps in a sarcastic tone or something, what is this worship to you, or with a role or something like that.
Sure, right. I mean, I can think of questions like that which are identical, but that either facilitate or bring conversation to a halt. If you ask somebody at a party, so what do you do for a living? That's really different if you're asking somebody with an interesting job versus someone with a very boring job, right? And you might not know that, for example, but something along those lines. Like it's not about the content of the question, but what it leads to, right? Let's see, Mike, and then Margaret, and then we read what Holly wrote in the chat.
It's I hadn't really noticed this before, but the wise child asked the question about the laws and the statutes, and the answer is when you don't get to eat dessert. And I think that's just rather hilarious that this is what the rabbis are concerned about, is when do we get to have dessert and when do we not get to have dessert?
I mean, have you met the rabbis? Like they're all about the sort of weird corner cases. But yeah, I think it is really funny that that's the one they go to. Like they could have picked anything from Mishnah Pesachim. But I think it's really I think the point that the Gemara follows that with a question itself actually really contributes to support for my contention here. Margaret.
Well, if you're talking about real life children in a family, children are sometimes told to be quiet. Don't bother me, I'm busy, and need to actually be told that it's all right to ask questions in this situation.
Good. So you're going right where we're going in the next section, which is obviously okay. If that's the case, if we're talking about trying to create a question asking environment, well, how do we do that, right? So that's where we're going next. Because
you don't want them to forget that they're supposed to be quiet when the adults are talking. But this occasion,
there's a fine line to draw here. Absolutely true. You want to have some snacks, but not too many snacks, and none with too much sugar, right? It's just grain or toasted grain and whatever. Okay, Holly says in the chat, I'm thinking about questions leading to other questions. also is symbolic of the growth and flourishing of spring. It's a generative, creative process. I like that tie-in a lot too. That's really nice. I love when like the sort of Exodus, like the story of the Exodus part of Pesach ties into the spring holiday, like beginning of the harvest season, the agricultural roots of it, because those are both like authentic roots of this holiday. And it's really nice when you're able to weave them together like that. I like that a lot. Okay. So I hope you're all asking the same question as Margaret is. How can we do this, right? How can we create this question-filled environment? What questions can we ask to support the environment? So, because maybe you're a Seder leader this year, and maybe you're a participant. Maybe you'll be a leader next year or a participant next year. So as we've noted, the content of the question doesn't necessarily matter. So I can't tell you just what to ask. I don't have any silver bullets for you here. But maybe we can come up with a framework, a way of thinking about the experience we're going for and what you can do both as leader and participant to enhance it. So I have two offerings at how we can understand this as a framework. This is the part that's by no means comprehensive, but I have two ideas for a framework. One is traditional and one is contemporary. Okay, so the first framework. I'll go ahead and read this one. Why not? So this is from Pirkei Avot, which is another tractate in the Mishnah. It's a collection of basically pithy sayings, sort of a bunch of famous rabbis. It's their catchphrases, the things they like to say a lot. And here we read, Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. But one that's not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is the controversy that's for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. Which is the controversy not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. So this is very illuminating if you already know who Hillel, Shammai, and Korach are, and absolutely opaque if you don't. So the Mishnah's model of a productive question-filled environment is the relationship between Hillel and Shammai. So Hillel and Shammai were actual real figures. There was a Rabbi Hillel and a Rabbi Shammai, but they've come to represent in rabbinic literature two schools, basically schools of thought that contended with one another, and they're basically set up in the Mishnah and Talmud as always taking opposite, as basically foils for one another, always taking opposite sides of any issue. Hillel always comes out on top. We always follow the ultimate ruling of Rabbi Hillel. Sometimes they conflict intensely, but by describing them as the model for machloket l'shem shamayim, controversy or dispute or argument, something like that, for the sake of heaven. Basically, the idea is they were, from the Mishnah's perspective, what made their contention productive and not destructive, because we all know arguments can really be not productive sometimes, was that it was for the sake of heaven. I usually understand this expression to mean that they were arguing in good faith. They both wanted to pursue the truth, and they wanted to figure out the best and most right way for a Jew to act in the world. And by interrogating one another and interrogating one another's statements and also their own assumptions, this helped them progress towards their shared goal of figuring out the best and most right path of the halachic path possible. Korach, on the other hand, is from a story in Torah. Korach attempted to lead an insurrection, basically against Moses, and this is understood by commentators as basically he was interested in power and influence for himself, and not in the shared pursuit of truth. So he's the model example of controversy that's not in good faith. It's not for the sake of heaven. So what do you think of this as a framework for question asking at a Passover Seder? How could we sort of hold this up as a model, or keep this in mind as we prepare our questions, either as the Seder leader or as questions we might want to ask as participants in a Seder? Lynn, go ahead.
I was thinking that questions can invite open questions, just like those 4 cups are an invitation. That's why everyone's obligated, because you can't exclude you shouldn't exclude from the table. But some questions, like sarcastic ones, are self-focused and they shut down, as we were talking about earlier. So
Sure.
that's what I was thinking about for the sake of heaven and being more invitational and collaborative.
Good. Yeah, I think it's a little bit different than what Hillel and Shammai were after, right? Hillel and Shammai were trying to figure out like questions of Jewish practice, right? Like how do we do the halakha? And that's not exactly what we're after at the Passover Seder. We're not creating halakha on the spot, right? Take care, Davis 6. And but we are still invested in a common project, right? If we're going with my claim that this is sort of about the atmosphere. So maybe this is useful if we sort of look at, if we imagine ourselves like Hillel and Shammai, not necessarily, doggedly pursuing truth, but as in good faith, invested in the game, in entertaining other people's questions, sincerely suggesting our own questions, not just to troll or to make fun or, be goofy, but to sort of advance the project of Jewish knowledge or engagement of the story or enhance the experience. Any other thoughts about Machloket L'Shem Shemaim as a model for Seder question asking? Okay, so my other thoughts, and it's funny, if you had asked me in rabbinical school, I would have thought this was so hilarious, because the term holding space, I'm just curious, and you can just show me your hands, have folks heard the term holding space before? Sari has. That makes sense. You've hung out in some academic and educational circles. Anyone else heard holding space before? Oh, Holly has? Oh, Stephanie? Okay, good. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So this, I would have laughed, and I was always sort of laughing behind people's backs, because this felt like a really cliched phrase at Hebrew College. People always seem to talk about holding space for this or holding space for that. And it wasn't really until after Hebrew College that I even learned where that came from, or I understood it intuitively, but never really figured it out. Now, Heather Plett, who I don't think can necessarily claim sole ownership of this. This is not a copyrighted phrase, but she has written a book called The Art of Holding Space, and has a whole website and a nonprofit organization devoted to the idea of holding space. And these are two selections from her writings, both on her website and her book, that I basically just pulled here because they're instructive. And I think this is another potential framework that's actually along the lines of what folks have kind of already been suggesting that might be useful for our Seder question asking. So she writes, what does it mean to hold space for someone else? It means that we're willing to walk alongside another person in whatever journey they're on without judging them, making them feel inadequate, trying to fix them, or trying to impact the outcome. When we hold space for other people, we open our hearts, offer unconditional support, and let go of judgment and control. To truly support people in their own growth, transformation, grief, etc., we can't do it by taking their power away. In other words, trying to fix their problems for them, shaming them, implying that they should know more than they do, or overwhelming them, giving them more information than they're ready for. We have to be prepared to step to the side so they can make their own choices, offer them unconditional love and support, give gentle guidance when it's needed, and make them feel safe, even when they make mistakes. So I would sort of hold this up as an idea. One that's actually, I think, easier for me to get my arms around is something I could potentially incorporate into a Seder that I lead. The idea of what I'm trying to do at Seder is not show off how smart I am or how much I know, overwhelming people with information they're not ready for, or making them feel bad for not knowing, trying to make sure they understand exactly the story of the Exodus exactly the way I want them to understand it, something like that. But to support them in their own growth. And I think this ties nicely back to what Holly suggested, question asking as growth, as a growth process. I think this is great. I brainstormed some sort of suggestions, like what would this look like in a Seder? Give people permission, either implicitly or explicitly or both, permission to trust their intuition and their wisdom. Let people know that you have worthwhile Torah. I don't care how much whether this is your first Seder or your 50th, you have important Torah to teach. Give people only as much info as they can handle. This is a serious problem for a lot of rabbis, myself included. Staying away from someone asks a simple question, you give them an overlong answer. Don't take their power away. Let them make their own decisions about what's worth asking about and what's not, how they want to interpret a particular text. Try to keep your ego out of it, and let people feel safe enough to fail and to just ask a question, put themselves out there, do something, take a chance, because question asking can be scary, right? Passover Seder can be stressful. What thoughts do you have? Does this resonate? Is this part of Seders you've been? Have you been to Seders like this? Have you been to Seders not like this? What are your thoughts on holding spaces and ideas as sort of a framework for what we're trying to accomplish?
I like to be in spaces where questions are not judged and where everyone's invited in to ask. So this would be a great Seder to be at.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I think so too. And I feel like I've been at them, and I feel like I've been at ones that are not like that too. And usually it's somewhere in between. Usually it's some kind of a mix, right? Yeah. Good. Do you have any other thoughts, points of speaking from your experience or otherwise, about what can we do at our Seders to do this, to make people feel safe and comfortable and encourage question asking? Do you have any tips or tricks or anything along those lines?
I don't think I ever actually saw this, practiced in action. I don't think I ever experienced this at a Seder, but I did hear a suggestion once that I liked to in advance of the Seder, suggest to all your guests that they come with a question.
Sure.
And that could be as open-ended as anybody wants, I guess.
I have seen that. I think that works really well, because when you know that everyone else is just as sort of responsible for asking something as you are, it sort of takes the pressure off. It's not oh, yeah, it doesn't let you hide, right? You're responsible for something, and that everyone else is just has something there too. But what am I trying to say? It's yeah, I don't know. It has a way of sort of taking the pressure off. It relaxes expectations. The expectation is one question, right? It's not that bad. Lynn, yeah.
The playing field a little bit.
Yeah, right. I think leveling the playing field is a good way to put it. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. Do you have any other thoughts, comments, or reactions to my ideas about question asking at Passover Seder? You did wonderfully. You asked lots of great questions and gave lots of great answers too. Good. Thank you, everybody. Well, this has been really, really fun, and I hope you'll all take at least a little bit of this. Something sticks with you in about a week and a half for Pesach, and hope it comes back and you have a Seder experience that's like this one. That's a positive question asking environment in all the ways we want it to be. Thank you, everybody.